Are you a leader who wants to bring more purpose and meaning to your work, both for yourself and also for your team? This episode of the award-winning Happier at Work podcast is absolutely designed for you. I'm Aoife O'Brien. I'm the host of the career and culture podcast, Happier at Work. And my guest today is Matt Poepsel, and we talk all things leadership. We talk about so many things in today's episode. We talk about the idea of fast and free. So these are the little things that you can do at work to make people feel better about themselves. So it can be reinforcing feedback, it can be positive recognition within the workplace, anything that really lets people know that they're doing a good job and that they're valued in the organization. And just imagine the ripple effect if we all took the time to do that today. We also talk about the role of individual responsibility. So it's not just waiting for the CEO to make a change. It's collectively our responsibility as an individual to be the change that we want to see. So what are the changes you would like to see and what can you do differently? So now over to the full episode of this week's Happier at Work podcast. Let me know what you think in the comments below. What's one thing that you're going to do differently after listening today? Matt, you're so welcome to the Happier at Work podcast. I know we've been talking about having this conversation for a while, and I'm so excited to dig in and have this conversation with you. Do you want to give listeners a little bit of a flavour of who you are and how you got into doing what you're doing today?
Sure, Eva. It's my absolute pleasure to be with you. I see your smiling face. I'm so excited to be following up on our conversations, as you pointed out. My name is Matt Poepsel, and I am the godfather of talent optimization. Fun little title there at the Predictive Index. So my job as a management consultant is basically to work with companies to figure out how they can align their people practices to really power their businesses. And it's really something I've enjoyed doing for a long time, probably because I was such a terrible manager when I first got started. I had so much to learn. It was just a journey of really trial and error. And I'd like to make things a little bit easier for those people who are coming up behind us. But if you'd be interested, I'll tell you a little bit more about how I got to this lofty position that I'm in today.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'd love to. Yeah.
it's so funny because my very first adult job was in the military. I was in the U.S. Marine Corps, and I spent 6 years in the Marines. And it was amazing because it was such a high performance environment, one where we spent a lot of time talking about leadership. And I thought, man, being an adult is pretty intense. So then I joined the corporate world, and I said, let's do more of that leadership stuff. And people were like, "What are you talking about? Like, we don't invest in that here. We don't do that the same way here." And I thought, "Oh, that's a real
Wow,
disappointment."
interesting.
Yeah, and so it was unfortunate. So I had to continue on my own
Yeah.
self-study and just kind of figure out show myself the ropes when it came to business, how to lead people, how to connect with them, executive presence, like all the stuff, right?
Yeah.
And I was so committed to it though that I decided to get my PhD in psychology and really study coaching and leadership at the highest levels, and really enjoyed learning about the theory and then applying it in my work as a software product executive and these types of things, which was pretty fun for me to try to do that. And things were going along super well right up until the pandemic, and then the
Ah.
wheels came off. I got hit with this trifecta of I turned 50. So I had that nice midlife situation that some of us get to.
You mean
And
I'm getting older?
I
What's
know, I
going
couldn't
on?
believe it. Then there
Yeah.
was the pandemic to contend with, so
Yeah.
everybody's values were being reprioritized. But at the same time, my father was diagnosed with kidney cancer,
Oh,
and he's enjoying his retirement now. He's made a full recovery, but at
oh,
the
great.
time,
Yeah.
I was like, what is happening? And it really threw me off of my foundation of work and my relationship with work. And it landed me safely on a meditation cushion of all places. And I got into
That
Buddhist
sounds like a
meditation
familiar
technique.
story.
Right? It happens to a lot of us. And I had this swirl in my mind of Eastern philosophy and Western psychology, all because I'm obsessed with work. It's all I can think about. And I came up with some happy collisions in my brain and ended up writing a book about enlightened leadership, as I call it, which is really about how we can turn our organizations into places where people can really thrive and grow and contribute and make an impact. And so today, the work I do is a big soup of helping companies through a combination of either assessment science or best practice or hopefully inspiration, education. I'm a bit of a teacher. I teach now at Boston College, which I'm very excited about. Lots of fun things I pretty much try to just go where I'm needed.
Brilliant. I love that. And there's so much I want to unpack from what you've said there, Matt. And I think where I'd like to start is the this realization. So joining corporate, and it's like leadership. We don't invest in that stuff here. Like, did they actually say that, or is that something that you realized over time that hey, they're not actually investing in this stuff, or did they come out and actually explicitly say that?
Both. So what happened was it was a kind of a smaller software startup. So they didn't have a ton of resources. This wasn't a very large organization. They didn't have a lot of formal training programs. But at the same time, if I asked questions, even of my managers, it was pretty clear that they hadn't gotten any training either.
Okay.
Right. It was one of those situations where they had been promoted because they were good at their jobs, but nobody
Yes.
really pulled them aside and said, here's how to lead people.
Yeah.
And so to me, it was such a different experience having gone from a place where from day one, you're taught about the importance of leadership and its principles in the military versus going to the civilian world. You could find people who had been in managing roles for 7, 8 years that really had never studied what it meant to lead people. They were just doing their best,
Yeah.
which I appreciate and respect. But at the same time, we can do better than this. Come on, right?
Absolutely, 100% agree. And I was in the lucky position that I got leadership training before I ever needed it. So I was kind of, I suppose, identified as someone who had high potential and was given all the training that I needed, and ended up not being a leader in that organization where I was trained, but I was able to use that skills in subsequent roles then, which was amazing. Um, Talk to me a little bit more about being a bad manager then, or recognizing that in yourself, or at least having the self-awareness to go, hey, I actually need some help here.
Yeah, I had an experience where I would try to translate what had worked in the military to the civilian world, and that did not translate super well at all. Not everybody has the like-mindedness of wanting to be as intense, I would say, in terms of the mission. In many cases, they didn't have the mission at all. Something I
Okay.
really took
Yeah.
for granted was the fact that
Mm.
anybody who enlists in the military sort of kind of knows the deal when they sign on the
Mm.
line. But
Yeah.
when you work at a software company or in a bank or at a dry cleaner or anything in between, you kind of have to manufacture your own mission. Like, why is the work what we do meaningful and significant? Why does working together toward a common goal, why is this important? And so I think that I probably just assumed that people felt the way that I did. And I think that that didn't make me as effective a manager because I didn't take the time to really
Yeah.
engage people and show
Yeah.
them their contribution, I would say. I was just like, well, of course, this is obvious, right? And they're like,
Yeah.
no, jackass, it's not obvious,
Mm.
right? And so that was one example. And then I think also I was so self-conscious, Aoife, about my own capabilities and what are people going to think, only come to realize that nobody's thinking about me at all. They're all going through their own me issues.
Yeah.
So it took me a long time to realize that the paradox of leadership, I like to call it, which is that it's not about you, right? It's
Yeah.
about the mission and it's about the welfare and the contribution of others toward that mission. By the time you get to your own self-interest, it should be pretty far down the list. So I had to kind of rebuild my brain from bottom to top.
Yeah. No, I love that. It's such a nice approach. Talk to me a little bit more about mission and the importance of that, because, like you say, I think in the military you can get
Mm.
it. You're like, you sign up for a reason. To me, I would also probably make that assumption that a company has a clear mission, like why are we here? Now, maybe less obvious is making the connection at that individual or at that team level, but maybe companies don't spend enough time talking about, well, why do we exist? Why are we actually here? What problem are we trying to solve?
Yeah, I think the companies don't, individual managers don't, we as individual people don't spend enough
Mm,
time thinking about. You could lump a couple terms in here, right? So what would we
mm,
say? Mission, significance, meaning, purpose. A lot
yeah,
of these things are they're not interchangeable, but they're all related. And the point I would make is that we have to recognize that as individuals, not all of us are wired to feel a tremendous tug when it comes to mission.
mm,
However, I think that everyone does want to be part of something bigger than themselves. I think that's fundamental in the human condition as we realize our own sort of finitude or our own limited nature in the cosmos. And so I think that to some extent, and maybe at different times in our careers, we're going to feel that. We want to be a part of a winning team. We want that
mm,
team to be meaningful. But that doesn't mean that if you work at that dry cleaner, like I talked about, that the mission itself doesn't drip off the page the way it does for a nonprofit or a hospital or being a kindergarten teacher or whatever you might be into. Uh, then you kind of make your own meaning and purpose. And maybe you send your customers home a little bit happier, or maybe you think about pressing a suit because somebody's going for a job interview that they really want to
Mm,
ace. You gotta manufacture on your own. And that's where I think that executives can do it for the company, and they should do all they can to really highlight those customer success stories, the reason why, understanding that we're not all out there, curing incurable diseases doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, right? To
yeah.
understand the mission, the value behind the products and services. For the manager, it's important to do it for the individual's contribution to the company. So
Mm,
even if you work at accounts payable, well, you're still making the organization's mission possible, right? You're
yeah.
making other people's jobs easier. You're, contributing to the profitability of the firm, whatever it is. Who cares?
Mm.
You have to be able to try to connect those dots. Otherwise, you can't just assume that people really drive home happily saying, boy, I sure did take care of those invoices today and I feel great about it. Yeah, maybe that happens, but
Yeah.
that's too much of a big risk to take to just leave it to chance.
Yeah, I think that can be twofold. So as someone who kind of likes that routine type of work, like I could totally get behind, okay, so I understand now my role within the organization and how that links to the wider purpose of what the organization is trying to achieve, but also fulfilling a personal career mission or career satisfaction, whatever it might be, by doing something that I'm really good at, that I can do quickly, that lights me up, that I'm able to actually perform really, really well or faster or just with happiness and enjoyment. So I think there's
Yeah.
there's kind of a twofold approach there as well. um I mean, the other thing that sprung to mind is this idea of purpose. So I've heard people talking about the big P purpose versus the little p purpose, and we assume that we need to have this big P purpose in order to feel like we have significance or meaning or a real mission. And it doesn't have to be like that. It can be actually at a community level. It can be the impact that you have on your colleagues. It can be much smaller, uh, much smaller P than what we perceive. Saving the whales or having a huge impact on the environment or having a huge impact through a new company, through social media, whatever it might be. Any thoughts on that idea of mission and how to kind of bring more of it into what we do on an everyday basis?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think when it comes to purpose, we can't judge the scope or the magnitude of anyone's purpose. Some people build extremely large businesses and some have small businesses. Some people are solopreneurs. We wouldn't judge and say one person's good and one person's bad at their job, because it's all about fit. And something you
Mm,
said a little bit earlier, like if we're taking advantage of your strengths and you enjoy your day-to-day work and that fit is there, happiness is going to follow. And hopefully there's a little bit of stretch for you and you're learning some new things on the job. That'd be great as well. And so I think that from a purpose perspective, it really does come down to your values, your strengths, your worldview. I think a
mm.
lot of times we don't think about that enough. And the fact is, let's say that you believe that the world should be mindful about details. It shouldn't be sloppy work. Diligence is really important to
Hey,
you.
I'm busted now.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah, look at
busted.
this. I love it. That's perfect. Then the point is that, if that's what you see as an orderly world would be a better world in your
Mm.
view, then certainly doing
Okay,
work
then
where
chaos. Yeah,
you produce that outcome is going to be purposeful for you.
yeah,
And I think that
yeah,
that's great. We need those people in organizations in very specific roles. But for someone else who's like, I'm a creator, I'm sloppy. I mean, we can't know the future. We have to experiment. We have to fail. We have to be willing to try new things. That's okay too. If that's your purpose and that's what gives you a sense of significance, then, you want to honor the muse. Okay, that's great. How do we put
mm.
you in a role where you get to do that?
Mm. And I think that is the really important part. You mentioned that word fit. I love this concept of fit. Let's not go down the road of culture ad versus culture fit. For
Mm.
me, it's culture fit, and we can have that debate another day. But you use the term fit, and it is about needs. It is about strengths. I love this idea. It's the worldview. It's like, how, from what perspective are you actually looking at the world? And I love how you
Yes.
articulate it, like a more orderly world is a better world for me, but it's not
Yeah.
necessarily how other people would perceive that. And I think it's an appreciation of the differences that each of us have and the unique strengths that we bring to the workplace as well.
Yeah, and there's a range there, right? So let's say that you and I are working together. You're very detail minded and I'm very creative minded. I have a scale of responses to your desire for an orderly world. I could tolerate it,
Mm.
Okay. That's kind of the minimum, pretty low bar there. I could acknowledge it and basically try to help you with whatever that means, or I could even celebrate it. Like in
Mm,
our work together, I could call out the fact that I love how much you're into an orderly world and you work so hard to make sure that every file has the right name so we can find them quickly when we need them, which reduces stress, which lets me go home and have a better time with my bride because I'm not all frustrated at work. That's not my superpower, but I love that that's your superpower. Okay.
mm,
That's like a celebrating it. How long did that take? Not long. How much did that cost? Nothing at all. So when things are fast and free, we should do those things, in my opinion,
yeah.
if they make the work go better. So in this case of talking about purpose and recognizing, like you said, we can respect one another's worldview and that we have differences in that, but we can also celebrate that because we need complementary styles to handle complex work. Most
Yeah.
organizations, and even for most solopreneurs, as you know, it's going to be a combination of skills you need. Sometimes you need to innovate and be creative. Sometimes you need to be rigorous and make sure you have detail orientation. So we're going to have competing goals and competing needs and styles, but they're only competition when we pit them against one another.
Mm,
They can be complementary if we allow them, but they turn into competitive if all of a sudden we entrench ourselves in our egoic worldview of saying, my way is the only way,
yeah.
or the way that you do things actually impinges upon my worldview, and we can't have a reasonable adult conversation about it and negotiate our differences.
Mm,
Instead, we're going to have to go to war, and we're going to have
yeah.
boundary wars about you didn't fill out your TPS form the right way, so therefore I'm not going to get you your expense report on time. Like, oh my gosh, this is what happens in bigger
Yeah.
companies, right?
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
a lot of energy that goes into people supporting their own worldview at the expense of others and at the expense of harmony.
Matt, did you just make an Office Space joke?
I might have. I might have. Did I date myself with that?
For anyone who hasn't seen Office Space, it's a 1999 cult movie about offices, and the TPS report is I don't know, like a monthly, weekly report that has to be filled out. And when this guy, the protagonist in it, makes a mistake, he has to hear about it 7 times because he has 7 different bosses. If you haven't seen it, check it out. The whole premise is that it's coming up to Y2K. For I think most listeners to the podcast are old enough to know what Y2K is. So yeah, we're coming up to Y2K and they have to update all of the software. But definitely go and check it out if you hadn't. Like, it's just, for me, one of the best cult classic movies that I've ever
Yeah.
watched. So slide aside from this. Um, Matt, before we get on to kind of talking a little bit more about this idea of enlightened leadership, I'd love to know what are the big challenges that you're seeing at the moment with organizations? Like, are there some specific trends? Are there some things that have changed in the last number of years? Are there some things that have accelerated? Like, what are the big challenges that are being faced by organizations or leaders within those organizations?
Yeah. In a general sense, there will always be friction in our organizations. And sometimes it comes from within, sometimes it comes from the outside. So we just have to recognize that in order to have a freely flowing, harmonious life or business, we're going to invite some level of friction. It just naturally
Yeah.
happens in this world of ours. What's creating friction is the way I might frame this. What's creating friction today
Yeah.
with these
Mm,
trends in the
yeah.
macro environment? It's amazing that we're in 2025 now, and I do a lot of research now around 2030. I'm interested in what the workforce is going to evolve into over the next 5 years.
Wow. Yeah.
Some of the trends are more demographic and technical. So some examples around talent shortages.
Yeah.
There's actually a real significant shortfall in the number of available workers to do work. Not every industry is affected equally, and not every region, but generally speaking, in the macro sense, it's true.
Mm,
Another is when we think about obviously the rise of AI, which is very
yeah.
empowering and exciting, but also unsettling to people who
Mm,
are being displaced
yeah.
by that. We're seeing that the average shelf life of certain skills is less than 3 years.
Wow. Okay.
Unbelievable when you think about how fast we have to learn new things.
Yeah.
And what about demographic shifts? Boomers are staying in the marketplace a lot longer because
Mm,
we're living longer and it's expensive. So a lot of them are hanging in. And at the same time, Gen X, like myself, much smaller generation,
mm,
and by the time you see Gen Z coming in, you're seeing wildly different values and expectations and preferences. So a lot of generational clash happening in organizations. Those are some examples. But then, kind of in a more humanistic realm, there's a massive interest in things like wellness at work
mm,
or stakeholder capitalism. How do we use business as a force for good?
Yeah.
So lots of trends that I keep track of and trying to see how they affect our way forward to create enlightened enterprise, but also how they affect us individually in our work experience on the job, which tells us our role as enlightened leaders, how we can go ahead and make sure that we're meeting the needs of the mission, we're
Mm.
meeting the needs of others, and we're doing so in a way that's aligned with who we authentically are as individuals.
Yeah, I love that kind of threefold approach, and maybe we'll come back to that in a second. But I'd love to dig into this idea of the talent shortage. Like it's something that has
Mm-hmm.
come up, and I'm genuinely trying to wrap my head around it because is it that there are not enough workers, that we don't have the skills, that those skills take a long time to learn? For me, I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, so can you not train people how to do what it is that you need them to do? Like
Yeah.
what is the actual issue here?
Yeah, it's complex in the sense that there's multiple factors. One is that the nature of the demographics, people are having fewer kids, so we have smaller generations now. And
Mm.
when you think about the generations that are still hanging out in the workforce, there's still a lot of demand. So, for example, with an aging population where the average age is going up and up and up, then in the healthcare system, for example, we need a lot of people to be able to provide all the healthcare services.
Okay.
Well, there's just not that many people in these generations
Okay.
anymore.
Yeah.
When you think about Gen Z and Gen Alpha, they're smaller than the boomer generation by a long shot. So some
Okay.
of it's just available demographics. Another comes down to, though, people who elect to drop out of the traditional workforce. Gig work is
Yes. Yeah.
exploding. So when
Mm.
you think about in the US, for example, driving for DoorDash or Amazon or Instacart,
Mm.
these types of things are attractive to workers who want to set their own hours and make a decent
Mm.
wage because those companies are making a lot of money, and consumers want a lot of those services, right? That's
Yeah.
the nature of consumerism has changed. Well, I talk to healthcare CEOs that say, what young person wants to come work in a hospital for minimum wage to work with sick people when they could drive for DoorDash? But how are we
Mm.
supposed to afford and compete to get people to come work for us? So we've had to shut down services
Yeah.
because we can't get the bodies to staff at the levels that we need to. You're like, what is happening? Right?
Yeah.
So
Wow.
that's another
It's a
example. And then
scary
as you
thought,
pointed out
though.
too,
Like as the,
yeah.
yeah, as you said, aging population, and when you need those services as you age, that there's
Oh,
literally not enough people to provide those services.
well, and legislation is coming in to say you have to have a certain number of services, for example, in assisted living and elder care facilities. And they're like, how? How do we do
Okay.
that and still
Yeah.
maintain our operating models?
Mm.
So this is the clash that you see, right? When all of a sudden we have these challenges. And I'll give you one example. I went to have some blood drawn, and my phlebotomist said, "I got to tell you, I love, taking people's blood, but the reality is, my boss is a jerk. The company doesn't care, and I can
Okay.
make just as much money driving for DoorDash the way that my husband does. So I'm thinking
Wow.
about quitting." Whoa, how much of that can we fix? And do we need to fix if we want to
Mm.
retain access to talent, right? She said she loves her job, but
Yeah.
hates the environment in which she's doing it.
Mm.
That's on that healthcare system, right?
Yeah.
They're not doing the things that are fast and free if the boss
Mm.
is acting like a jerk and the culture isn't, meeting that part of her needs. She's not
Yeah.
saying, I don't want to do my job anymore. She's saying, it's just not worth it.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, it's not just about the money. Like if you could get paid more to do that other thing, but you don't enjoy it as much, then would you actually be willing to make that move? Or if, like you say, they could fix whatever's going on in that healthcare service provider, teach the manager how not to be a jerk, how to actually
Mhm.
manage people properly, how to do those. What's the phrase that you use, Matt? The fast and free,
Fast and free. Yeah.
fast and free, like feedback. You're doing a great job. Here's where I see your potential. All of this kind of stuff.
You have a detail-oriented worldview, and we would really need that around here. Thank you so much for bringing that superpower. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And
Well,
what a
and
difference that can make for her and for the organization.
yeah, and you mentioned the point about competitive pay, for example. We're seeing evidence that in certain socially oriented and impact oriented companies, through stakeholder capitalism, for example, they're seeing a 25 to 30% less than competitive market pay. People will take less money if they believe and feel
Hmm.
good about the work they're doing
Yeah.
and the work that you're doing as a company. So it's kind of bogus to say, we can't afford it or this, that. Yeah, if you're a heartless, a gutless company and you have no real impact and you're in it for yourself, yeah, expect to pay more for people to come in and want to be a part of that and contribute
Mm.
to that. So I think there's it's a shift in the level of consciousness we need to bring to how all of this stuff works together. And I would hope that any executive and any manager would say, yes, we should do the fast and free things if it makes our customer service better, our employee experience better, our financial performance better. And anybody who says, no, I'm not willing to do those things, well, then they shouldn't be a manager, period.
I'd love to reflect back to you and kind of say the opposite of all of those things. And you alluded to it just before you talked about it. And it's this idea of paying more to attract talent when you have that not so favorable environment. And we could, I don't know, we could call it the jerk tax. You're going to have to pay people more to stay in that environment because they're not getting treated very well, or they're not, they're not having that positive experience that work should be.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And you might consider it a transactional tax. If it's only going to be transactional,
Oh,
you're going to
yeah.
pay me to do a job. I'm going to do the job, but I'm going to have to go get my
Yeah.
meaning somewhere
Yeah.
else. Then you're
I'm
going to have
gonna
to pay me a
be,
little bit more for
when
that.
it's the what is it, the hands versus the heart. So you're paying me to
Exactly.
use my hands to do the work, but you're not paying me to engage and to really care about the work that I'm doing.
But what if you came to work and I said, I'm not only is the work you're going to do meaningful, but we recognize you have things you want to accomplish in your career and new skills to develop, and we're going to invest in your professional development as you learn on
Yeah.
our projects because we're going to
Yeah.
benefit from that too. And that way you can grow into the type of career that you'd like to have. That's a transformation situation versus
Yeah.
a transactional situation. You'd be like, I might actually be willing to take less because you're giving me so much value in another form. I'm getting psychic income, I'm getting professional development, and I get to feel good. And my friends are going to love hearing about all the great stuff I'm doing to save the
Mm.
planet or whatever the heck.
Yeah. Yeah.
All of a sudden, you're like, okay. So then, that's how all of the thing we have to understand that value is not simply economic value, but
Yeah.
they're related, right? So now all of a sudden, if we create value because we're going to help people grow, experience well-being, we've got unlimited paid time off, don't expect us to pay higher than market if we have so much value we're giving you in other ways. And you might say, well, how will we find enough people to fill these jobs? You don't need all the people. You only have so many jobs. You need the right people back to fit. You
Mm.
need culture minded, mission oriented. What's the opposite of a jerk tax? Benevolent coworker tax. Yeah, these types of people are the ones you need. So when you're more clear about what you're all about, you're transparent about it, and you're selective about it, don't be surprised when companies that are really desirable to work for, they have 100 people applying to jobs,
Mm.
right? And where the transactional companies that are just another company are struggling to find people who want to come work for them.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what's happening out there because everything has changed, Aoife, except for the way we think about our businesses and the way that we manage our people. If that's not going to change, then don't expect to stay competitive for long.
Mm. That you need to change with the times as well. Love that.
100%. You have to do business the way business is being done. And what people are saying now, especially young people, post-pandemic people, we don't have all of this access to AI. We haven't spent all this time studying business just to have another job. Like, where else in our lives do we accept the same old thing from 10 years ago? I can order a pizza now and watch the blue dot make its way across town to my house.
Mm.
Like, everything has changed, except the way we approach work, where we spend all of
Mm.
our time as adults. That's ridiculous. Or to
Yeah.
say, well, we can't really make a profit and, do well by our people. No,
Wow.
ridiculous. Outdated, right? All these
Outdated.
things are
Yeah.
outdated.
Totally.
So when I talk about an enlightened mindset, it's really opening up to these new ideas, these casting off the way things have always been done, moving away from our self-interest. That's all it takes. And I know it's all it takes. Like it's easy. It's not, it's simple, but not easy. I
Yeah.
acknowledge that. But I think it's just so important. I don't want to see phlebotomists leaving their job or
Mm.
companies paying a jerk tax and not being able to pay a bonus to their company just because they didn't take the time to figure out how all these dots are connected, right? I
Mm.
don't want us to go home to our families less capacity than we could have had otherwise because we had a bad day of work because of doggone TPS reports. Like we got to fix this. It always comes back to the
What do you
TPS
think
reports.
is the what's holding people back? So
Fear,
what
fear,
makes the
Aoife,
big difference
fear.
between companies that are doing this and they're doing it really well and the ones that haven't even taken it into consideration?
Well, I think companies that do it really well not only have had that sort of realization that we can do things a different way,
Mm.
but they're willing to try, and there's so many examples, countless examples. Think about Patagonia, right?
Mm.
So, apparel company, owner says, "Oh, my company's worth $6 billion plus. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to bequeath it to the planet so that when I'm gone, I'm not passing it down to my family. The planet gets to benefit from that." You're like, okay, that is an extreme example of
Mm.
someone who is living their values, right? So let's go something a little bit smaller. In the US, we have a company Bombas, and they say, you buy a pair of our socks, we've specially designed new socks for the homeless and we'll donate a pair to the homeless.
Mm.
Okay, great. So now all of a sudden you're like, was that hard? Like, and that's not even a new concept. Tom Shoes did
Mm.
that a long time ago. Buy
Yeah.
one, buy a pair, donate a pair. Okay. So you're in a business you're in a software company. You can't donate a pair. Okay. What can you do? Like, I think this is the willingness to ask the question of what's possible. That's
Mm.
one of the first things, that mindset shift of what's possible in terms of making sure all of our stakeholder needs are being met is absolutely where it begins. Now, as soon as you start to try to do it, you're going to run up against friction, no matter what, because people have fear. We have practices that are habitual in our companies. This is the way we've always done it here. We don't have management infrastructure for some of this stuff. I get it. I get it. So then you have to have that commitment, that fire in your belly to say, we're going to fight through this friction to get to that place where we get to be one of those enlightened, sort of desirable types of companies.
Mm.
And to recognize and go in front of your board, if you're an executive, and say, we need to do this. Right? It's not easy. It takes a lot of courage to go to the board and say, we're going to take a little bit less profit while we figure this out. Like, we should be paying a lot of respect to our company's leaders who are doing these things, right?
Mm.
Because it's not easy to go and try to make these types of changes, but it's important, doggone it. It's important. You're talking about people's welfare. You're talking about the financial performance of the future of your firm. Like, there's so many reasons to do it. We got to get past that friction.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. And if we bring this back down to the individual level and say, okay, this is going to be really hard and it's scary, what are some of the things that maybe get in the way at that individual level? But then what are some of the benefits that come? Like, what's in it for me, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think that you get a lot more alignment with the things that really light you up genuinely. So when you
Mm.
understand and you're clear about your values and your purpose and these sorts of things, and you commit to living in line with them, everything gets easier.
Mm.
Everything gets easier.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean everything's easy, but everything gets easier.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
what's not easy is when you do work that you hate and you compromise and hold back some part of yourself and you try to convince yourself that it's okay. And you go home and you're so tired and exhausted that you can't even bother looking for a new job. So you just binge Netflix or whatever. Like, that's not an easy life. It
Mm.
looks easy on paper. It's not easy. It doesn't feel easy inside your brain. Instead, when you say, you know what, I'm all about detail orientation, and that's the world that I see is a world that's orderly. And right now, quality on my team isn't as high as it could be. And so I'd like to bring more of my natural superpower, and I'm going to make us 1% more quality minded.
Mm.
I'm going to celebrate. I'm going to create a new award on my team. There's no money, it's just bragging rights, but I'm going to recognize the quality producer on our team once a month. And we're going to make a big deal about it at our team lunch or whatever. Fast and free. What is
Mm.
fast and free that basically takes your worldview and actually puts that ripple out into the waters of the universe to say an orderly world is a great world?
Mm.
And all of a sudden you're going to drive home and you're going to be thinking, did you see how much Sally was smiling when I gave her that quality team member award at
Mm.
lunch? And she was really so, like, I recognized, I don't think I have to worry about Sally leaving because she
Mm.
saw how much we appreciate her,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
These
Love
things
that.
are possible, Aoife. They're
Yeah.
possible, but we have to want to do them. We have to have awareness. It all starts with awareness.
Mm.
And we have to have the insight that how these things actually matter and why. And
Yeah.
then we actually have to follow through. We have to
Mm.
take that action to actually do the things.
Yeah.
And don't be surprised when you're a manager and you're like, your team has really been, firing all cylinders. They're actually showing up in my team's meetings and they're like super happy with what you're doing. Keep it up, right? You get noticed, you get promoted, all these kinds of things. Then the other team managers are like, I got to step up my game. I got to keep up with Aoife.
Mm.
She's making her team like all excited and motivated to work here. Like what? And then they're going to come to you for tips. Like this is how we start to make change. You have to
Mm.
be the change, right? And then all
Yeah.
of a sudden it becomes contagious.
Yeah.
So
It's so
don't wait for the
funny.
CEO to go to the board and say, we're going to take less profit to turn this whole thing around. That's not an excuse. You can't say, well,
Yeah.
what am I supposed to do? You're supposed to do whatever you can do. Find
Yeah.
your little P until the big P catches up. Like, let's
Exactly.
get to work.
Yeah. 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 Like to me, it's taking it back to the individual level. It's that taking personal responsibility for how you show up at work and the environment that you create. And if you find yourself that you're exhausted at the end of the day and you're binging Netflix, as you said, you know, what can you do? What changes can you make to actually do something about that? And do you want to actually change? Do you want to create something that's more meaningful and that's better for you? Matt, before we wrap things up, is there anything else that you wanted to share from an enlightenment perspective from leaders, from organizations? And like to me, the idea of thinking about what's possible, or asking the question, what's possible, and not using excuses to get in the way to say that would never work here, or that won't, are there some organizations who maybe think, oh, that definitely won't work here, or leaders who think that won't work in our organization?
Yeah, I think that the one thing for me is that these are all just stories, right? We put so much meaning into the stories we tell ourselves.
Mm,
And what I find is that I've been delighted because I've been studying beliefs, and beliefs are so powerful because they really drive the thoughts and emotions that we have, which ultimately drives our behaviors. So we spend way too much time trying to fix our behaviors when we spend too little time mining our beliefs and really turning up the volume on the beliefs we want most. And the reason I say that is because when we think about biases that we have, oh, that won't work here. Oh, we tried that. Oh, that might work for Bombas, but that's not going to work for us. It's just a story. It's just
mm,
a story. But how do we move from bias to benevolence and start to say, what if it did work? What could it look like? What could our version of that look like? What if we were to try it? Like all of a sudden, by reframing those beliefs, we will naturally change the thoughts and the emotions, which will naturally change the behaviors. And don't be surprised when a month from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, you do the fast and free things automatically at that point, and all of a sudden you're in a very different place. And then you get a little greedy for it, and you're like, how can we have an even bigger impact? How can we, impact our communities 10 times as much as we just did last quarter,
yeah.
like whatever it
Mm,
is? Like it becomes possible
yeah.
because it all comes down to the stories we tell ourselves. So if it all comes down to stories anyway, why not start telling yourself better stories? Reframe those beliefs.
Love that. But to me, I'm also thinking of the impact that has globally, the impact that has on the world at large, if those ripple effects happen within organizations, and think of the impact that you have on your colleagues.
100%. And I think that, I don't talk about it a ton, but I absolutely believe philosophically about the interconnectedness for sure.
Mm.
And when you think about things like the butterfly effect,
Oh,
butterfly
yeah.
flaps its wings halfway across the
Another
world.
great movie
Yeah.
suggestion.
Oh my gosh. Like all these things. I think it's true that we're more connected than we could ever possibly realize.
Mm.
What that means is that this is incredibly good news. Because on the one hand, while you have to guard yourself because we're so connected, we've seen that, unfortunately, the downsides of it. But what about the good sides? Let's reframe our beliefs and tell ourselves stories again. That means that if I make one hyper-local positive contribution on my team and I recognize Sally for quality because that's my worldview, what ripple have I just put out into the world of work, right?
Mm.
Now, all of a sudden, what if every manager in America and in the world did this, for example, just for one day? Like it
Yeah.
would fundamentally change the system, right?
Mm.
So the point is that you can't fundamentally change the system, or can you? Because all you can do is make your localized ripples. This is the other side of the paradox of the leadership coin, is where I said leadership isn't about you. When it comes to action, you can only control you. You can
Yeah.
only take action yourself. You can't make anybody else do anything. You can only create conditions for them to choose to do things themselves. So the leadership paradox is while it's not about you, you're the only one who can do anything about it. So start, making these sorts of changes, these hyper local little ripples, and don't be surprised when everything that comes back to you are these great crashing waves of benefit and of positive impact. It's absolutely possible, Aoife.
Brilliant. Love that. Matt, the question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast: what does being happier at work mean to you?
I think you have to really make all three of these engines fire. One is around performance. You've got to be able to do your best work, whatever that job is that you're doing. So that's number one. The second is around the people. You have to be able to have this positive impact on the people around you. You have to be able to enjoy their company. You have to be able to be contributing and helping them to have the highest possible levels of well-being and growth that you can. And then the last one's that purpose that we talked about. If you feel that there's meaning personally, but also significance in the external sense to the work that you're doing, in my book, ideally even serving something bigger than ourselves and something bordering on the spiritual benefit of just doing good work in the world, then I think those three things of performance and people and purpose, I think if you are checking those three boxes, I think happiness is going to flow pretty naturally for you.
Brilliant. Love that. And if people want to find out more about you, if they want to reach out to connect, what's the best way they can do that?
Yeah, LinkedIn. I'm fabulously active on LinkedIn, so that's definitely a good one. And then my own podcast, Lead the People. Love to have guests like yourself on the show, and just really, really just try to do everything we can to try to highlight this more enlightened approach to leadership and our world of work.
Love that. Thank you so much for your time today. I so enjoyed this conversation. We could probably talk about all these different things for a few more hours. But let's wrap it up there in the interest of brevity. And if people want to learn more, they can reach out directly to yourself then. Thank you
I
so
love
much
it,
for your
Eva.
time, Matt.
Thanks for all that you do, putting out all this great information. Really appreciate you.